Enjoy. Welcome, everybody. Yes, it's great to have you here. I guess we're also celebrating that we missed a hurricane, but we are keeping in our hearts, and thoughts the people up north that were not as lucky. So we are very excited. We're welcoming some people back from far away, like Don and Nina, and also welcome back. And it was recently Don's birthday, so let's give him a round of applause. Oh, yesterday. Okay. Feels like a year ago sometimes, but and we also have Joe Manning back from London. So it's a very international crowd, and so we're very excited to have you all here. This is also part of our fall lecture series, but it just so happens to be Hispanic Heritage Month as well, and it all worked together. And we're very lucky to have from the City of Miami Beach Hispanic Affairs Committee. We have Gustavo, please wave, and Natasha as well. And thank you all for your work. And also the chair of the committee, Carmen DeTore, was here as well, but she had to go. So we're very happy. We hope we could do more to connect with the community, and because we have a lot of non-native English speakers here that are part of this community as well, in particular the historic districts. So I didn't tell her this in advance, but I'm wondering if our wonderful commissioner, Tanya Bott, can come up and say a few inspiring words. And actually, while Tanya's coming up, I think I want to say that we all need to thank Tanya, because when Governor DeSantis decided to veto all of the arts and culture budget for the entire state this year, Tanya took the initiative to say, you know what, we have $40 million in resort tax reserves sitting on a shelf. Let's tap into that, and let's fully restore the funding to all the Miami Beach institutions. And she was previously on the MDPL Board of Directors. Now, please welcome Commissioner Bott.
I've said this before, but if you are happy or unhappy with my job so far as a commissioner, it's all Daniel's fault. I met Daniel when I was just a neighbor getting involved in a local neighborhood issue in 2015, and we pretty much hit off pretty well, and got involved in more and more things together. And so here I am. So again, it's all his fault. Where it's fault, it's credit. Listen, I don't want to take up much time because I know you're not here to hear me that long, but I do want to tell you you're here so you know how important this is. They're not just the preservation, but the understanding of architecture and the role that it has in the community in which it resides. I mean, Miami Beach is what it is because of the architecture that has been preserved and evolved. I mean, everything from the log cabin, which is on the horizon, the imminent horizon there restored, to, I know everyone thinks it's not going to happen, but I promise you that all the way up to the 1111 garage, which is not maybe everybody's cup of tea, but it's a striking, beautiful piece of architecture. So it's not just that they're passing the city in amber, but more delighting in the architecture that reflects the community for which it was bought. It reflects built rather for the community needs for which it was designed. And speaking of that, the South Shore Community Center, which is, I don't know if it's included in today's lecture, but it is a very important piece of architecture. And we're fighting for years. Kristen Rosen-Gonzalez, my colleague on the commission, took up a fight, and pretty much ran out of steam at the end of last year. She allowed me to pick up about that, and with the support of other colleagues, we found a different site for the fire station, and we have preserved the South Shore Community Center. I actually sponsored legislation repealing the demolition order. So,
thank you.
get it designated as a historic site. With full support of our historic preservation officer at the city of Miami. So I'm very optimistic that that will move forward. But you know, when you're fighting to save the South Community Center and relocate Flamingo Park, it was a very contentious issue. It passed countywide referendum by 75%, including even the Flamingo Park being agreed to it. There's still work to be done, but I got a lot of nasty letters, let me just tell you that. But the one that made me laugh was from somebody who was impassioned about how sacred our green space is, and normally I would agree with her. But she said about the South Shore Community Center, I mean, it's so ugly, and there are no tour buses going by to look at it. This is not a map with the stars trying to I don't know what you're used to, but, you know. And the people really thought that they think that the South Shore Community Center is unappealing. And to many, we're not going to change their mind. And I've been in it before, but I've spent a lot more time in it over the last couple of months. And for those of you who already love rootless architecture, it's probably not a shock to you. But the interplay of light and dark, and in this case, Marxlopolis is designed for a community that was underserved, having community spots to gather, indoors and outdoors. The roof is designed to be activated. There's a garden there. It's a very welcoming place to be, even if it's not got all the bells and whistles we're so spoiled to have and have gotten so used to, the gorgeous, decorative kind of architecture that we have. And, you know, the textures of the walls. And, you know, it is beautiful in a whole different way. So I'm thrilled that we have such an illustrious piece of modernist ruralist modern architecture in our midst, because there is a lot of it, and it is, I think, much more interesting to look at than the City Hall, which is in the same camp, but not really as interesting. Anyhow, so it is an honor to be here. I'm thrilled to have been a part of it, Daniel, for all my years of activisting since 2015 and counting. And let's turn it over to the folks who are on the show.
Thank you. Before we start, also, if Gustavo from Hispanic Affairs Committee would just say, just let us know briefly about the committee's work. Yes, thank you. Please welcome Gustavo.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome to this marvelous presentation. That is going to be amazing. So, the Hispanic Affairs Committee, we are trying to get our community closer to everybody else. So we do a group of presentations, activities through the year, and it's really nice because, you know, a lot of people come in. We have the Salsa Festival in October. We have, you know, the honoring of the monuments that we always do at Collins Park, and, you know, we're working on bringing another monument, and it's going to be great. And this monument is the figure of the San Martin, which is the person that freed Argentina, Peru, and Chile. So we need that because now the Argentinian community has grown so much, and we need that representation here. And as an Hispanic, I just wanted to remind everybody that, I mean, this is kind of un-Hispanic, but it's a fun data, because yesterday we celebrated Cliff Erickson's radical, you know, the designation day. Because I don't know if you remember that Cliff Erickson came here 500 years before Christopher Columbus. So that's really important for us to know and never forget. They were like in Canada, so they saw him first. And then another thing I like to always remind everybody is that the Hispanic community has like these faraway cousins in Africa. In the west coast of Africa is a country called Equatorial Guinea, Guinea Equatorial, and this country speaks only Spanish. So I just, nobody knows this, so that's why it's why I took upon me that everybody knows this. So anyway, without any further ado,
Great, thank you. Thank you, Gustavo. Okay. And so now we're going to get to the reason you're all here. Well, before that, I do also want to welcome the other reason we're all here, which is the photographer, Sylvia Ross, who is here. Could you wave? Hello, Sylvia. So Sylvia and Tim reached out to us and said, hey, would you guys have an interest in this exhibition? We didn't have it in our calendar, and we usually only give like 5 feet for visiting exhibits, but when we saw the photos and the story, we thought it just made perfect sense. So we worked really hard and made it happen, and I think it came out really nice. So
Thank you guys for trusting us with this.
and without further ado, let's all welcome Tim to share about the design. And he's flown in from Kansas. He's a professor there at the university, and we're excited for his talk. So let's welcome. So if you just...
Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Let me just give you a quick little introduction first, and then we'll get into it. So my name is Tim Hossler. I teach at the University of Kansas. I'm the design chair, actually, and I teach design history, design ethics, publication design, exhibition design, kind of a whole mismatch of things. So my background is I grew up in Kansas. When I was about 13, I told my parents I wanted to be an architect. My parents had nothing to do with anything creative. The only architect they'd ever heard was Frank Lloyd Wright. And so being an only child, from the age of 13 on, every family vacation was based on Frank Lloyd Wright houses. So it went to Chicago, Arizona, California. It was a great education of just like actually seeing architecture and being there. So I went to Kansas State University, studied architecture. In the middle of architecture, I kind of realized that being an architect is not necessarily what I wanted to do. I knew I loved everything about architecture school. I loved building models. I loved doing drawings. I loved doing photography. But, just like being a real architect was not necessarily my path. I became more of an art director. My wife and I got married right after school. We knew we wanted to live in a big city, so we moved to New York City. Neither of us had jobs, but we just started off. I ended up working for Annie Leibovitz, the photographer. So I was her in-house art director for 5.5 years, right at this kind of transition time where she was still shooting everything on film, but then slowly moving it to digital and all the things that we could do with digital. The interesting time. I knew I wanted to teach, so I went back to graduate school at Cranbrook Academy of Art in Detroit. And then I was the design director at Mass MoCA in Massachusetts for a little while. And then if you know Kathy Leff here in Miami, so I met her at Mass MoCA. She convinced me to move down to Miami. And so I was the art director at the Wolfsonian for 5 years. And that's where I met Sylvia. Sylvia was the in-house photographer at the time. And we became great friends with her wife, Anne. And just a really good friendship that's lasted almost for like 20 years, which has been great. So that's my background. That's kind of how we got together and why we do projects together. So I know that this is probably a very educated audience, but I want to start at a very basic starting point. So I just want to talk about concrete, first of all. So basically the definition of concrete is it's a composite material made of a mixture of cement and aggregate. So it's cement, which is this kind of, it's made in different ways, different over history. They've used it in different ways. Let me switch. Okay. So they've used it in different ways. And then aggregate is basically sand or some kind of stone. And then you have to add water. And then obviously the water evaporates and it has something solid. So this is maybe the way that we usually see concrete being used or being constructed. So it's a slurry, or it's this kind of watery substance that then gets poured into some kind of framework, and then from that framework, then it dries. The frame is taken down, and then it's taken that shape. Something we usually call this reinforced concrete. So the idea that you would put steel rods inside the concrete as it's being formed, which gives it much more strength, Makes it so it's not going to fail. It just makes it so that you can do a lot more interesting shapes. So that's kind of something that's done as it's being made, and it's all covered up, but the concrete is all around it. Just a quick little example of some form work. This is another sort of like kind of hacked together in a way form work. Concrete can take on whatever shape or whatever, any kind of the details of that form work. So sometimes you'll see concrete work that looks like it has wood patterns in it. That's the wood patterns from the framework that are left over from it being made. Concrete also takes a lot of craftsmanship. So about smoothing it out, getting it all trimmed, getting it all finished. Two other kinds of concrete. You have concrete block, which can be basically used like bricks. So using mortar to put it together. Many times then stucco will go on the outside of it. So you can't really tell that there's blocks. It just seems like one solid wall. Also you have precast concrete. So this would have been, these probably some kind of drainage tubes. But you also have that sometimes in housing where pieces will be made off-site or in a different location. They'll be precast and then they'll be brought in and then put together. So history-wise, concrete has been with us for a long time. The Romans became very good at it. This is probably one of the best known concrete buildings of Roman times. It's not all concrete, but what is concrete is this roof structure. So this is a section drawing of it where you can see the oculus at the top, which has there's no glass covering, it's just completely open. And then the light comes down through and that's what illuminates that inside. And then here you can see, at the time the Romans weren't using reinforced concrete, so it's unenforced concrete. It's pretty amazing that they could span this amount of space and also be this beautiful. So this is the inside of the Pantheon. So same like what we do today, this would have taken some kind of framework, some kind of mold that then gets removed after it dries. So I just want to go through some examples of 20th century architecture. And then once we go through this, then we'll get to these actual photographs. So in 20th century architecture, I had mentioned about Frank Lloyd Wright. So this is one of the first places on a family vacation we went. This is in Oak Park, a suburb of Chicago. This is Unity Temple, built about 1908. One of Frank Lloyd Wright's earlier pieces. But what he was looking at was the decorative nature of what concrete can become. So he's designing, this frieze, the little details, then that gets into a mold, and then this is what happens with the church. Frank Lloyd Wright also went through this, he called them textile block phase. This is when he was doing mostly work in California. This is in Los Angeles. If you know Los Angeles at all, you can see the Griffin Observatory in the back, so kind of placement of that. This is in the 1920s. And so what he's doing is he's designing these individual blocks that then have a texture and a pattern, and then that repetition of the pattern is what kind of makes it so beautiful. So that's on the inside and it's on the outside and it's on the inside. You might be a little bit familiar with this house if you're a science fiction film fan. The house is used in Blade Runner. And sometimes it's been used in other movies, but you'll recognize that block pattern. Most of the time it's used in a completely strange, different way, but it's this house. And this is just a little detail of like those blocks. Frank Lloyd Wright's most famous piece, Falling Water. So out in rural Pennsylvania, obviously you can see that this isn't all completely concrete. It's stone also, but these kind of big, kind of off-white horizontal planes, concrete. There you can see it there. One thing about Frank Lloyd Wright is he was always pushing things kind of to the limit of engineering and kind of stability. So the Falling Water, the organization, it keeps the house preserved. over years has always had difficulty just making sure that that concrete stayed up. And then one of his last pieces is the Guggenheim Museum in New York City, all concrete. This is the atrium space inside of it. You know, I mean, this is another great example about what concrete can do, how it can be curvy, how it can like take the form of whatever it needs to. It's really like, it's kind of this plastic thing in the architect's hand about, you know, just how beautiful, how sculptural it can become. This is an image of the building under construction in the late 1950s. So now we go from Frank Lloyd Wright to Corbusier. Corbusier is a Swiss-born French architect, just a little bit after Frank Lloyd Wright. You know, he's one of those, Frank Lloyd Wright really didn't like any other architects. Definitely didn't like Corbusier. You know, Corbusier had this idea that a machine, or that house was a machine for living. So, you know, strip away all the decorative things, keep this like, it just is, everything's very mechanical. This is his most famous house, the Villa Savoy. Concrete. The most interesting part of this is actually the roof structure. So up on the roof is kind of a garden area, and then you have these kind of curvilinear spaces that then create different spaces on the roof. All throughout his career, he used concrete. This is a big apartment building. This is in Marseille, France. Almost an identical one is also in Berlin. But again, you know, concrete. He had this idea about the apartment buildings being these little individual two-story units that are kind of like plugged into this structure. And again, the interesting part, I think, is that what happens on the roof of the building. So you have something a little bit more playful, a little bit more organic shaped. And then one of his last buildings, it's called Ronchamp, or the Chapel at Ronchamp, where his work really becomes very sculptural, all concrete again, having less of a grid structure. So this is going to bring me back to Kansas, actually. So a lot of the European architects, you know, in the early 20th century, one of the things that they started looking at was American grain elevator or Canadian grain elevator. Mostly these were the buildings that were in Buffalo, New York, Minneapolis, Minnesota, I think Toronto. But these were the concrete structures that these architects, they were really in search of an architecture form that really the form was about what the function was. And so they loved these grain elevators because they felt like there was no decoration, there was nothing extra. They were basically concrete tubes that were just made to hold grain. So this is actually from Corbusier's Towards a New Architecture, his book that came out in the early 1920s. Corbusier is one of those architects that, you know, before he ever built anything, he wrote a lot. And so we have a lot of his writing that predates his actual buildings. And these are some Kansas grain elevators today. So similar. Most of these in Kansas were built in the 1940s and 50s. So predate the things that were influencing the European architects. I used to say that I think that grain elevators in some ways are kind of like American blues music. How, you know, American blues music, it gets recorded, it gets played on British radio. People like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones hear that music. They create this new kind of music, rock and roll, and bring it back to the US. Where the American grain elevator was something similar, where these European architects looked at this building structure we had, remodeled it, used it in a different way, and then kind of brought modernism back to us. This is near where I live. So this is in Hutchinson, Kansas. This is the world's largest grain elevator, just half a mile long. But I think, you know, like in a photograph like this, you can see sort of what those European architects were like inspired by, you know, because again, no ornamentation, beautiful, simple form, and the form tells you exactly what's going on inside the building. This is an image of grain elevator being torn down. You know, and here you can see that reinforced, the steel that goes into all of this. Just a couple more architecture examples. Marcel Breuer, he taught at the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus gets closed down in 1933. Many of these people end up going in different places. There's architects that go to Israel. There's architects that come to the United States. There's architects that go all over. And that's why, you know, that you have Bauhaus architecture in these different places. This is actually a church in Minnesota. I wouldn't look at this and say that's Bauhaus, but I think it's what he kind of evolved into. This is the interior of that building. You might be familiar with this, the Whitney Museum of American Art. This is not the current museum building, but it's the building they had from 1966 until just a couple years ago. Definitely a brutalist building, concrete, known for those strange windows, also known for the ceiling. This is the ceiling in the entrance area. In the galleries, it was more of a grid of concrete structure. This is actually one of my favorite Marcel Brewer buildings. This was, originally it was the Armstrong Rubber Company building in New Haven, Connecticut. And then it became the Pirelli Tire Company building. And then for a while it was owned by IKEA, because IKEA opened up a IKEA right next to it. And currently it's a hotel. Eero Saarinen, Finnish American architect. So I mentioned that I went to Cranbrook. Cranbrook is where Eero Saarinen grew up. His father built most of the campus, was the head of the school in the early years. He actually didn't go to Cranbrook, just grew up there. But his work, especially in the late 50s, becomes very, very sculptural. So he breaks away from kind of that typical grid of modernism into something much more plastic, I guess, or movable. This is a TWA terminal at JFK. This is the interior of that building. This is also a hotel now. So if you ever go to, I would love to do like this East Coast trip where I stay at all these great building hotels. Just a quick side, this is actually by Ezra Stoller, this photograph. There's several photographers that were really well known in the 1950s for architecture photography. Ezra Stoller, Julia Schulman, Balthazar Korab. Those three main guys kind of photographed all of mid-century modern architecture. And as we start to look then at Sylvia's work, I see similarities in it. This understanding of place, this understanding of context, not just about showing the building as this, place completely empty, but also showing it with people using it. I think I just have two more just historical examples. Softy's Habitat 67. This was done for the Montreal World's Fair in 1967. Here's an example. This is it being constructed. So this is all precast concrete. So these individual apartment units would have been done on the ground or off-site and then lifted into place. It's just kind of like a building block of putting it together. And the way that this works is it just makes some really interesting outdoor spaces and terrace spaces for these different apartments. Last kind of historical example I want to show, Felix Candela, Spanish-Mexican architect. This is a well-known church from the mid-1950s. That's the exterior of it. This is the current interior. So Candela was very interested in basically like pushing structure to its limits. Looking at things mathematically, looking at curves in different ways, and then thinking just about how with concrete, how he could make that structure work. This is a sports stadium he did in Mexico City for the 1968 Olympics. Okay, so those are kind of the historical examples I wanted to show. Another big thing that happens in the 1950s is Museum of Modern Art in New York has this exhibition called Latin American Architecture since 1945. The exhibition went from late 1955 to early 1956. There was a nice book that went along with it. Here what you can see that blow-up photograph of the Tropicana nightclub in Havana. So there was probably 4 or 5 Cuban buildings that were included in this. There were other buildings from South America, Mexico. But it was just this really kind of groundbreaking exhibition where it was showing the architecture of Latin America that many people weren't necessarily familiar with. Probably most people were probably looking at it as, sort of like this European architecture transplant to Latin America. But I think what this exhibition showed was that there was something really unique and distinctive about this architecture. Okay, so that now brings me really to Sylvia and to this work. So if you look on Sylvia's website, one thing you'll see is that she doesn't just do architecture. Sylvia has a very similar background to what I have. She studied architecture, so she has a degree in architecture. At some point decided that she didn't really want to be an architect. Really enjoyed photography, and then really just became more and more skilled at what her profession is, and does everything from photographing people, photographing movements, photographing artwork. Like I'd mentioned, we met at the Wilsonian. I remember at the time at the Wilsonian, she had to shoot everything on film, and the curators wouldn't let her retouch anything. So she had to become so like prolific at making sure shadows were perfect, making sure glares were perfect. And so I think that kind of learning about technique really then she applies to photographing architecture. So the first time I went to Cuba was January of 2015. It was 2 weeks after Obama had first made the announcement that the United States and Cuba were going to try to repair their relationship. It was really just by chance. I happened to be doing a study abroad where I took students to both Havana and Miami. So that was in January. That next August, Anne and Sylvia had mentioned about they were interested in going to Cuba. And so I had some research funding. And so we all went to Havana for a week or a week and a half. It was the first time that Sylvia had ever been to Cuba. Like a lot of people in Miami, she's a Cuban American who has family ties in Havana and outside of Cuba. A similar story where upper middle class family, they basically have to kind of leave Cuba, hoping that someday they'll return, but then that return never happens. And so there was things that Sylvia wanted to do on that first trip where she really wanted to go back to her family apartment, where that she had a photograph of her mother as a baby on the outside terrace. She went back to find the family farm, where she had a photograph where we knew for sure that was the floor pattern if we could find it. So all those things were things that we didn't think we'd really going to find, but we did. We searched through the cities. We knew what street it was. We didn't have an address, but we found that apartment. We drove all through the countryside finding the farm, and we found it. And it was fun to be with Sylvia on that trip, because it was fun to be with someone who had this connection to that place, but not in a necessarily she didn't have it, but her family had it. But it was still kind of a coming back home. That was our first trip to there. Sylvia took lots of photographs. And then she got hired by 2 professors at University of Miami to do this book. And so if you're interested at all in Cuban modernism architecture, I feel like this is probably the book to find and look at. It's filled with Sylvia's photographs. It's filled with a lot of historical photographs. But it really documents this time period from 1940 until 1970, where, again, it's very much a distinct Cuban architecture. And then for a little bit after the revolution too. So this exhibition that's here now actually started off at the Miami International Airport. So we had 2 walls there. So we had a wall of Havana images, and we had a wall of Miami images. And so for us, being in this space is great because it's the first time where they can actually be together, and they can you can be in that same space and you're able to compare the 2. So my role is I'm a designer, an exhibition designer, and a book designer, curator. I did a little bit of writing for this one. But as an exhibition designer, basically I'm given the dimensions of something, and then I figure out how the work is going to fit into it. So for me coming here tonight, it's really fascinating and exciting because I've only seen it in photographs, and I've only seen this space as measurements, I guess. And so my first thought was, wow, this is smaller than I thought it was, which is typical, when you're designing something distant-wise, how you feel about it. So these were the original drawings. Like all projects, you go through lots of different iterations. You go through a lot of changes and adjustments. But I was just so happy with the way this one turned out. And it's fun also to see how closely it looks exactly like the drawings, which as a designer, that's what you always want. Just a couple quick images of it being installed, and the final piece. I just want to walk through each of the images just a little bit and just give you a little bit of my thoughts about why we chose them. And then I have some more images that we'll show, but I'd love to have Sylvia come up when we show those so that she can give you any kind of feedback or you can ask questions about it. And yeah, so let me just walk through these. So this starts off the exhibition. It's one of the kind of only sort of interior images we really have. And it's just I think it just really shows exactly a very kind of moody feel that we love to have this start off with. This is actually the Bertolt Brecht Cultural Center and also a synagogue in Havana. What I love about this image is that the stairs and the building itself are then reflected in the floor pattern and just kind of all flows together. The Solomor building is an apartment building in Havana. This is not the typical view you usually see. This is the view from the street. I'll show you another image a little bit later from the other side. But this has to be one of my favorite buildings in Havana. Apartment building, just has these kind of rippling wave patterns. Just like beautiful 1940s, maybe kind of streamlined modern building. The Jose Marti Park, which again, it's a sporting venue. Someone was asking me if it's in use. Like so many things in Havana, it's probably in use, but at the same time, it also kind of looks like it's in ruins. And I guess that's another just point I'd like to point out about Sylvia's work is that, I think a lot of images of Havana really play on the whole idea about the city in ruins and things falling apart. I think that Sylvia, when she photographs Havana, she's doing it in a little bit of a different way. I think there's a beauty to it. I don't get the feeling like it's the sadness of ruin, but more the celebration of these really beautiful spaces. This is the Havana Riviera Hotel. At the bottom it says about who the architects were. That Johnson in the name of the architects, that's Philip Johnson. So Philip Johnson, the famous architect that then goes on to do postmodernism, heavily connected with MoMA also. This is the diving platform into the pool. If you look closely at the actual image, you'll see there's a sign that's hanging on it on the stairs saying, "Do not climb." This is the Nautical Club. This is another view of this is actually the cover of that Cuban modernism book. Also, there's images, I don't think we don't have them up obviously, but there's images of the Tropicana nightclub, which has a similar roof structure. And then here's an apartment building in Havana, which I think the most fascinating part on this one is that roof structure, which is almost like this origami, concrete, kind of not a napkin, but sort of like this really interesting structure on top. And then the Miami photographs. This is probably one of my favorite images. I love the Shark Valley. I love it how it's this modernist structure that's kind of out in nature. And it's almost like just hovering over nature. Also, I just love seeing the people there, looking out. This to me is one of the most futuristic looking buildings, at least in a photograph. The Miami Marine Stadium. Just such a beautiful stadium. So this is Ilario Candela as an architect. You'll see he's the same architect on several of the Miami structures. So he's a distant relative to Felix Candela. So not brothers, not brother, son, just distant relatives, but both doing similar things. Felix Candela came a little bit earlier, but really thinking about concrete and how can you use concrete to make these really interesting, planes that cover different spaces. One of the buildings on Miami-Dade College, the Kendall campus, the Miami-Dade College North Campus, just kind of a concrete detail. And then the Broward County Southern Regional Courthouse. So, one thing I would really highly suggest that you do for this exhibition is, I think there's a great power in big photographs. And that's what I love about just having large images, is that I feel like you can get close to it, you can see details, you can see the graffiti on the chairs at the Marine Stadium. You can see, the people on the Shark Valley structure. In the Havana images, you get to see people on the street. So I think all those details are just so important. So One of the things that Sylvia and I are working on is putting together more of a book of this work. So again, it'll be a combination between Miami and Havana work, probably both separated. This is ideas currently for the cover and the back cover. And then I'd love to have Sylvia come up. I'll just show you a few of these images that are probably, they're not in this show, but they're going to probably be included in the book. And so we have Havana first, and then we have some Miami images second. So I think this would also be a good time to open it up for questions. If as we're going through these, if there's any questions you have or anything that you want to give a comment about. This is the Capri Hotel. So another kind of well-known 1950s mid-century modern hotel. On the left is the art school, and the right is the art museum.
We have a question back here.
Okay. Yeah.
Just wondering, when you mentioned who was the architect of this house?
It was Hilario Candela.
There's some other really amazing photographs of the art school. The art school was a school that was started after the revolution. So very, very organic. The school was very much promoted by the government of Cuba at the time. In the late 1960s, the buildings still were incomplete, not completed. The Cuban government kind of switches its stance on modernist architecture. And then the buildings, although they're in use, are still somewhat never completed and never finished. On the right is the image, the more kind of typical image of the Solimar apartment building.
It's Partagas building. It's called Partagas building. Oh, that's actually a building. It was an old tobacco factory. And they used that building to house the employees.
This, I believe, is the architecture building.
Yes.
So it's like their architecture association, their headquarters. So on the right is the exterior of it, and the left is the interior.
Question over here. Yeah. Does the Cuban government have a program for designating buildings for preservation?
I know, like in the center of Havana, they do, the old town of Havana. I think like most things in Cuba, like I'm not sure how much money and how much funding there really is for things. So they may have it, but they may not be able to do anything about it. Yeah.
I sort of look the same way at Miami Beach in that when Miami Beach was kind of run down when I first moved here in the 90s, we still had a lot of our, original buildings here, and it was because Miami Beach was run down. Low budget equals preservation.
Yeah.
When you got developers come in and then, want to make some money out of the place, that's when all the great buildings go, because there isn't any preservation code, locked in.
And that's happening now in Cuba too. So they have some developers with a lot of money who are knocking down a lot of the buildings. Yeah.
Yeah.
Show a picture of the Olympic Village, 1968.
Was that you mean the Montreal?
South
Breaks up into the we did the architecture for that.
Which is South.
Yeah.
Where?
Which is South.
Oh, I'm sorry.
He should be a household name. And that was his master's thesis.
Right, so that was really the very first building he ever had built.
That was his star.
Yeah. So he's an Israeli, Canadian, American architect. That you're talking about the one that's like all these blocks pieced on top of each other. Yeah, and so as a student, that was his student project. And then and so he was able to get that built, partly probably because it was the World's Fair and they just needed some things built. Yeah, it's a fascinating building.
It's an engineering lab. This was an engineering lab.
So this is another view. So the Nautical Club is one of the big images. This is looking the other direction.
You can look at the images of these when they were new and fresh and in use, the way they intended to be at the beginning. In other words, making comparisons is what, have happened over the years.
Yeah, that exhibition I was telling you about at MoMA, that book actually has some beautiful images of, these are 1950s photographs of these buildings that are pretty much brand new buildings. There's a lot of other images. They were well documented. And, at that time, Cuban architects were, they were in American architecture competitions and winning awards. And So a lot of Cuban architects, I believe, were educated in the United States. And so it had been, I know Candela he went to Georgia Tech and then went back to Cuba. And then after the revolution came to Miami. What's that?
The MoMA book, is it still in?
The MoMA book's not in print. It's fairly easy to find. And MoMA does a really good job of, they put PDFs of all their past exhibitions that are out of print. So you can see all the pages. There was also a more recent exhibition, which was kind of the second version of that, a couple years ago on Latin American architecture, which just kind of like followed up that show. This is the ice cream, ice cream restaurant?
It's the ice cream center of ice cream. Copelia, yes, Copelia.
And who was the architect?
I don't have that.
I don't know exactly who it was. You know, you had mentioned about how that it's, you know, that sometimes when you don't have money, that preserves things because you don't have the money to change it. You know, like one thing I noticed when I first started going to Cuba was that you would have these beautiful mid-century modern buildings that still had the mid-century modern furniture, you know, and so everything felt like, oh, this is really original. And then after going back a couple other times, it became a little more Miami-like, you know, like things had been kind of cleared out, things had been updated. I would say not updated for the better, you know? And so it's a little bit sad to see that kind of stuff go away. That's because I just remember here at this ice cream restaurant, they have the Bertoya chairs. That's all the outside seating.
Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
You know that when it opened on the back of the floor, and they started with 56 flavors. And they were serving the ice cream on plates and stuff. They have taken to the mansions to the people quite loud. So these plates used to only last for like 3 days. They just disappeared. They walked out of the place. And 3 days after they opened, they were down to mint ice cream.
Wow.
It's a little thing what there.
Yeah. And this is another version of the Jose Marti Stadium. No, it would have been like running race. And what would the infield have been?
I'm not sure.
Just like a green field for the infield.
Is that right at the volleyball?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I actually was just thinking about a few months ago and they're repainting it.
Oh, really?
I have seen pictures of that.
And this is getting now to Miami. What is this building?
The School of Architecture. UM, University of Miami.
Where? UN. What's his name?
University of Miami.
These are two other versions of this building right here.
And what's that building?
This is the Jackson, it's on the Jackson campus. It's a mailman building. It's just one of their campus buildings. Downtown. This is also Candela. Actually, if you look, this one here is Candela. These four that are together, they're all Candela.
What I love about this photograph is I just like how you see structure, but you don't necessarily know what the structure is, and then you get to see the landscape. This was mentioned a little bit earlier, 1111. I'm sure you all know this, but when I talk to students about this, I always point out that like this is actually an addition. You know, this is an addition to that brutalist white structure on the right.
SunTrust Poetic.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
It's not its own freestanding building. It's an addition to the original building.
So it's meant to be a parking garage for it.
Yeah, they're connected.
Yeah.
With some details.
Now I have more respect for Miami Beach City Hall. Where are these? Where are they?
This one's on Brickell, so it's the Colony building, and I think they're converting. Yes, it was. And I think they're converting it to condos now. And this is I forget the name, but it's a bank building downtown. It's the county building, yeah. It's the county building. Yes, exactly, the Stephen Clark Center.
I never thought those were that. I never saw it probably. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, I think that's something that good photography does. It gives you a new view of something. It maybe edits out that stuff that clutters it up. It just gives a better view of what you're looking at.
Can you talk a little bit about painting the concrete and not painting? Because now we've got the community center here that we're going to have to just manage to say. As Tanya was talking about it, and people are going around and around about what it should be. Should we strip it down to the concrete, or should it be painted? Whatever movie colors they want, whatever color. How do you guys feel?
I mean, I feel like these are great examples of both. I think you could do something beautifully both ways. That one is painted and these are not. I like the look of concrete personally, but that's just me.
Yeah, I would say I'm kind of this minimalist.
Yeah.
I like it when it's... But then at the same time, like on those Kansas grain elevators, they're so beautiful when they're white. And they're these kind of white cathedrals from a distance.
I'm always so disappointed when they pour the concrete for the bridges for the highway and stuff like that.
Right.
When they finally paint it, I'm always so disappointed because I love looking at the movement on the concrete.
Yeah.
The natural effects.
Right.
This is FIU South. It's the student rec building.
Yeah.
What?
How do you get the vantage point?
From which one? The last one? There's a parking garage across the street, and so I spend a lot of time sneaking in and out of parking garages. I've been kicked out of the best ones, so. The parking garage right next to this. This is the street is like right here. This is 8th Street. It's like all the way the furthest east on the campus, and it's a fairly new building. Yeah. I mean, not that it's a few years old. This is the teachers union. This is downtown. No, this one. The one on the left is the teachers building. And the one on the right is the Fort Lauderdale Library.
And the slide
Previous. This is the federal courthouse in Fort Lauderdale. And this one on the right is Miami-Dade North campus.
It's just a different view of that, right?
It's a different. Was that originally a water feature?
Yes.
Yeah, then no longer.
Yes, exactly.
Was there one person that invented this concrete? Like, somebody that came up with the idea, and then all of this came out from that. Can you go back to history and say this person was kind of the inventor of?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think you can quite go back find one specific person. Yeah, I mean, so concrete probably predates the Romans even, it's in other civilizations also. And so I think that probably they just, over time, they just started realizing that they could form into whatever they wanted, and then just how people build off of each other.
It wasn't like Galileo or one major person,
No, I think just a time. I know, like in the Middle Ages, there was a period where they really didn't do things in concrete, and so that's why you have stone churches, and you have like the Middle Ages, and then it becomes kind of rediscovered, in the 1800s.
For me, when I look at these, it looks like everything has been built on somebody else or something else. Just kind of like how it all started way back then.
Yeah.
I don't know. But
yeah, I think definitely, of 20th century architecture, these different people have come and other architects have made adjustments and reinterpreted what they did, maybe sometimes misinterpreted what they did. Like Corbusier, what he was looking at was what he loved about American grain elevators was the same thing he loved about bridges. Like he loved American engineering, and it wasn't about the aesthetics of it. He just loved the idea that they were making these things that were just to function. And so I think that, it's architects in being influenced not just by other architects, but by other trades or other, materials. So I think we're almost to the end here. Actually, this is the end. So the back view of the Marine Stadium.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
I want to welcome, we have a very special guest that arrived during the lecture, who is here, and that is our Vice Mayor, Alex Hernandez. So let's welcome him for a hoop.
Thank you for inviting us.
That's our amateurs.
That's our amateurs, right? Thank you, Daniel, for inviting us and for organizing this lecture. For me, it's fascinating as a Cuban American, but someone that hasn't been to Cuba, to see this bridge between Havana and Miami. And my mind always goes, well, number one, to heritage, to family, to culture, to music, to food. But then when I think of architecture, of being that bridge, and of all types of architecture, concrete architecture. You know, this minimalist style of architecture. And it just makes sense. We share so much more, even today, between Miami and Cuba. And it's something that is greater than all of us and even our own community, which is our tropical environment. And this element specifically highlights that. Its durability to our tropical environment and its flexibility. And so it really is quite spectacular to see this exhibit, and I hope many people do come in and experience these beautiful pictures that highlight, you know, the openness, the simplicity, and how functional concrete can be over what we often look for in architecture, which is something that's very ornate. And it's something we've been challenged with in Miami Beach, especially as we work to save the South Shore Community Center, to understand the importance and the significance of this concrete architecture. I'm so grateful to Commissioner Connie Abad, who came into the City Commission, who took on an incredible leadership role out of her own endeavor to save the South Shore Community Center as an important symbol of this special type of architecture that it takes time to appreciate. Someone that grew up around this type of architecture, for me, you know, I would see it and I always seem to see the beauty in it. But with time and with education and experiencing not just these buildings from the outside, but going inside them and experiencing them from the inside, you really get to appreciate it. And that's what I see the beauty of your work here, Sylvia. It's just not pictures from outside. You also go inside the building and give us these vantage points. And so, Tanya, Commissioner Bott, I don't know if there's anything that you would like to add. I know you're always shy to say something.
No, I actually had the honor to say a couple things I wanted and unannounced. But about the South Shore Community Center, we couldn't have saved that unless we found a better option for the fire station. And this guy made that happen. So, we have a good commission.
We have a good
commission. A lot of good stuff done. So there's hope for the future.
So today, I'm proud to be here alongside Commissioner Bond because Daniel reached out to us to inform us of this beautiful exhibit. And we want to celebrate you, Sylvia, celebrate the incredible work that you've done here, not only in your artistic contributions here, but including your other contributions throughout our country, including the National Museum of American History, where 86 of your photographs documenting the LGBTQ movement in the United States has been exhibited, and all your other great work. And so on behalf of our mayor, our city commission, but really speaking on behalf of our community, do we proclaim today Connecting Concrete Day in the city of Miami.